Let's pray. God, we give you thanks for this day and a chance to be back together on Wednesday for our study. We ask, God, that you would use this time to open our hearts and our minds to all that you have in store, and that we may look down and find our feet where yours have generally been. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. So the point of this study, what we're going to do is this statement here is right kind of where we are. If we're going to follow Jesus, it's helpful to know where his footsteps regularly led. So if we're going to look at that, we're going to kind of spend our time kind of looking at 4 places where if you read, investigate Scripture, you'll kind of find out where they are. And so I'm going to kind of talk about that. We're going to talk about kind of introduce that today, first steps. And then we're going to kind of each week, the next 2 weeks, we'll talk about 2 different places where Jesus' footsteps generally led. So I want to talk a little about education and how they did education in Jesus' day as we look at first steps. There's a statement in Josephus, who's one of the great historians of the church, who talked about the importance of education for that. There's this book called the Mishnah, which is one of the kind of ways they kind of look at all this stuff and kind of tell us what went on back then. But it's above all, he says, we pride ourselves in the education of our children. So that was a description of that, how that went. That's the same system that probably Jesus would have grown up in and would have learned from. Education was a big deal in Jesus' day. We were talking about our schools here, but education was a big deal. There's an ongoing argument about which age a rabbi would start to have his own students as a pupil. One rabbi said, under the age of 6, we do not accept a child as a pupil. From 6 upwards, we accept him and stuff him with a Torah like an ox. So they're trying to fatten these kids up with education to kind of get them ready to go and kind of know that they're trying to grow them up. The Jewish education system was made up of 3 primary stages. There was 3 kind of ways in which they looked at this. The first stage is this Bet Sefer, which translates to house of the book. And this is the age when these young kids, age 6 to about 10, that all boys would go through this, and it was just boys. Up until the age of 6, a household would be responsible for training a child. The mother or the father or an older sibling, or sometimes a servant would be charged to do that. If the servant was educated, they would be charged with kind of teaching them basic kind of stuff. It's kind of like, your parent may have taught you, or you taught a child how to read or to write before they went to school or in the kindergarten and how to count and their colors and stuff like that. We learned in kindergarten again, but you were responsible for teaching these kids this kind of stuff until the age of 6. And during that time, they would have been expected to, from these ages, to memorize the books of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy. I mean, memorize. Some of them are hard enough to read, much less to memorize, and they were just to memorize them. Now, not just the names of the books. They were to memorize the words found in the books. So they had to memorize these books of this. The next stage they had was called Bet Talmud, which means house of learning. And from about ages 10 to 14, they would go from Bet Sefer into this Bet Talmud. During this time, a student would continue to memorize Scripture. They would memorize the Psalms and the prophets and the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. It wasn't uncommon for a good Jewish boy to have the whole Old Testament memorized by the age of 14. Because that would have been everything in it. Yes?
Were the girls educated in any of this?
No, not really. They would sometimes be educated by family. They would be taught kind of that, but not kind of formal education. This was mostly reserved for the boys in the group. The student during this time would also begin to learn the art of asking questions and answering questions. In our education system today, we're into information transfer, right? But in those days, answering a question wasn't quite as direct. Rebecca was proctoring the state tests at the schools. She was there and sitting there watching these kids take these tests, and they want to make sure they got the information that they need to have at the age they're supposed to have. But they don't do that. In those days, it wasn't just about answering the question in a direct way. A rabbi might ask a student, what is 2 plus 2? And today we would expect the answer 4. But back then, a rabbi would ask the question 2 plus 2, and a student might answer with something like, what's the square root of 16? Another way to express the statement. I mean, that's a silly answer because that wouldn't have been what it was, but it's kind of that same kind of model. It would ask another question that would have kind of given the same answer. That was kind of how they were told to do that. And you think about this, we think about this training and this habit of how they acted as rabbis. Think about some of the stories we have of Jesus and how they come to him, an expert in the law comes to him and asks him, what's the greatest commandment? And he returns with asking another question. That's how they answer things like that. Today, they tell you never to answer a question with a question, right? That's what we were told, right? But in this training, that was pretty normal. That's what you were supposed to do. And so they would do this. And so they were kind of at this age where they were supposed to do this. The only story we have of Jesus during this time was from this age. It says after 3 days, when they had been to Jerusalem and had left, and the convoy to go, they found Jesus was not there. They found Jesus in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. This was his habit. He was in the training of this, and so he would have been kind of versed in how to do this, and so it would not have been that. And everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So again, it wasn't like they were saying, he was able to solve great aquatic equations or something like that, or do this great academic work. It was that he had a grasp and understanding of the scriptures and the ways of God, and was able to answer these questions, and so that found a good thing. So Jesus in the temple at about age 12, it says, we found him doing just about what a boy his age would have been trained to do. Asking questions of the elders and answering questions with questions and showing insight. About the age, somewhere on this age, a boy would celebrate what we know now as a bar mitzvah, a religious ceremony for the coming of age when a boy would become a man. By this age, he would have been expected not only to have the Torah completely memorized, but the Psalms and the prophets and the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. About this time, most boys would have had their education ended. They would have been sent home and to learn the family business. A rabbi would have kind of looked at his students and said, you're pretty smart, but I don't think this is about the end of the road for you. So go home and learn how to be a fisherman, or learn how to be a farmer, or learn how to be a carpenter, or whatever it might have been that their family did. And sometimes at this point, students would go home and they would learn from their dad to learn the family business. And sometimes if their dad was in a different business or was in one of those kind of things that he didn't do, they might send him off to live with another family to be apprenticed in a certain trade that they might learn. The story I remember from my own life of this is that my dad was a high school assistant principal, or middle school assistant principal, all the time I was growing up. So I went to work with my dad sometimes in the summer, and I'd play in the gym. I'd shoot basketball in the gym while he was working, or he would give me jobs. Like I was responsible every summer for, he'd pay me so much per locker if I would change the combinations in all the lockers so that the new students who come in would know the new combinations and not have the 8th graders wouldn't have the 6th graders combination from the locker they had last year and stuff like that. So I would do that, and I would get paid by the locker. It was not very much, but I got paid by the locker anyway. But my dad didn't have a job. I wasn't like learning my dad's family business. That wasn't what I was going to do. But my best friends, their brothers, their dad was a millwright, and he fabricated metal stuff and for the Ford plant or for GE and the big corporations in town, and he would do all this stuff and work on their conveyor systems and do all this thing. And he was pretty prolific in his own company that he did this. And I would often spend the night at their house after we were out for Friday night or something like that. They would come in, and if I was there on Saturday morning, his dad would wake us up and say, "Come on, let's go. We got to go work." And I would work at the millwright shop, grinding steel or painting or whatever it might be, welding stuff. I would do all that kind of stuff because I was learning his dad's family. It was like I was sent to live with another family to learn the trade. And so it also, what it started for me to do was to realize I did not want to do that for the rest of my life. Now, my friends, almost all of my friends that I went in high school, went away to college for a semester or a year, and then went back home and started learning their family business and doing that kind of stuff. And they work for these companies and all that stuff. And they're very successful. They do a great job. I knew very quickly that I did not want to do that. And so I was pretty clear I wanted to make sure I finished my education and did something else. So much so that when I did very poorly in my first semester of college, and I came home and my dad said, "You have one more semester to get this figured out, or you're coming home and getting a job." And I thought, no, I don't want to do that. I didn't want to learn this business. So that's kind of how it was. And every kid at that point wanted to be the guy that the rabbi said, "Come with me and learn a little bit more. Go a little bit farther." And boys would really kind of be expected to, they wanted to have that opportunity to stay along and study with the rabbi, but only the brightest and the best of the best would have been chosen to continue to learn from the rabbi. Now that took us to stage 3. Stage 3 is this Bet Midrash, which means house of study. And this is about age 14, 15, and on up from there. It would kind of go on. It wasn't really kind of, they would start about that age. And it would go, basically it would go until a rabbi would look at a student and say, "All right, that's enough. You can't go any further," and they would be sent home at that point. It could be done at any point. But again, the best, the brightest would always be asked to look at, and they would join a house of study, which is a rabbi's school or a study group that a rabbi would have, where he would have disciples, various numbers of disciples, and they would follow the rabbi around, and they would learn from the rabbi, and the rabbi would teach them, and they would sit on the temple steps outside, the teaching steps outside the temple, and the city of Jerusalem, and they would teach them lessons about the stories of the Old Testament and the things they would do, and they would interpret things and like that. Students who would be chosen from the best of the best would continue to apply the oral or written law from things called the Talmud and Mishnah, the sages, years of kind of commentary that rabbis had written about these Old Testament scriptures. And so some of the stories we have, even in the New Testament, when they start telling these stories, when Jesus starts telling these parables, are ways in which Jesus would have been like a rabbi interpreting some of the things that he wanted to say. And when he says things like, "You've heard it said, but I say to you," he's like, not according to this rabbi's way of thinking. There's a different way of looking at this. And so it would have been kind of some of that he would have been doing with his disciples and teaching them kind of some of that. At this point, after they got into that, adults of all ages, including women, could attend the sessions whenever they had spare time. Many would study without being teachers just to kind of become better disciples, even at advanced ages. Only a few would be dedicated enough to spend training becoming rabbi teachers themselves. So this thing was called the Mishnah, which is and there's 2 different spellings depending on how you translate the Hebrew to do that, but it's the first written collection of the Jewish oral traditions. And so there was the Torah and the Old Testament, the prophets, the Psalms, all that kind of stuff. But then there was this oral tradition that was told, and they would start to tell these stories, and that you would learn these stories. And so you could tell by the way that you told a story what rabbi school you went to, because that's the way they interpreted the story, and that's the way they told the story. And so you started in fact, you'll hear a lot of stuff in Jewish traditions. They'll say, "Well, as Rabbi Hillel used to say," as so-and-so used to say. And they'll use a rabbi's name because that's kind of the school of thought that they're in there. And so they would do that. The Mishnah says that at 5 years of age, you should study the Scripture. And then study the Mishnah. At 13, you should be subject to the commandments. At 15, study the Talmud. At 18, you should be married. At 20, you should have pursuit of a livelihood. At 30, you're at the peak of your strength. At 40, you're full of wisdom. At 50, you're able to give wise counsel. At 60, you're old. At 70, you got a fullness of years. At 80, you're at the age of strength. And at 90, you have a bent body. And at 100, you're as good as dead. You might as well go on with it. So that's what the Talmud is saying about ages. So I don't know if you follow that, but you can kind of figure that out.
Sorry, what was the 60s?
I think it was, let's see, 60 was, at 50, you're able to give wise counsel. At 60, you're just old.
But did it say at 80 you're the strength is what you...
Yeah, your age of strength. So, I don't know. There you go. You got strength. There you go. All right. So really, about the age of 20, they would know they were expected to get married. A rabbi would look over his students again. At this time, most of them would have been sent home again to learn the family business, to get ready for marriage, and begin looking for a profession. He would say something like, "You obviously know the Scriptures, but you don't have what it takes to be a rabbi. Go home, learn a trade, make babies, and pray that they grow up to be rabbis." And so we would send them home and expect them to get married. Yes.
So if I'm under Rabbi Steve,
Yeah.
and you said, yeah, you're not making it, could I then search for Rabbi Ryan and he would accept me, or are you at that point damaged goods?
Yes. And as we'll talk about how the rabbis would select students, we're going to discover that unlike what Jesus does with his, we'll discuss a little bit later, you would often ask, or your family would ask, for you to study. Can I study with you, Rabbi? And can I be one of your students? And they would test you out and see if you measured up. Jesus, of course, selects his disciples. He goes out and searches them, and in fact, as we discovered, he says at one point, "Don't remember, you didn't choose me, I chose you." And then there's a difference there about how that worked. Yeah, you could, and you would often do that. In fact, there's stories about like when Jesus has an encounter with John the Baptizer, and some of his disciples leave and start following Jesus because there's something different. Even John said there's something different about this guy, and so that was not uncommon. But you didn't have to. A lot of times, families would ask for their son to be able to study with his rabbi. Do this. So, man, think about this. So that's a habit. Think about James and John's mom coming to Jesus and saying, "Hey, I want you to let my son sit at your right hand and left hand." It's almost that same kind of request of let my sons be your prime students. Let them be the ones who follow you most closely, who do this stuff, and so it's not we preach it and we teach it a lot of times that it's totally this egotistical kind of request, but it's more than that. Yes, there's that, but there's also this sense in which it's a part of some of the traditions that they would have done when they would have asked some people to do it. It's an interesting kind of a dynamic to look at how that works. Think about this. Some people would, like I said, marriage was encouraged by 20, but some young men were so earnest in their studies that they would put it off until later so they could study full time. Paul and Jesus kind of fit into this tradition of setting aside marriage for the sake of ministry. This is likely what Jesus meant when he said at one point Paul said at one point, they have become eunuchs for the sake of heaven. It's this kind of idea we've forgiven all this kind of stuff of life so that we can do that. It's probably also what Paul meant when he said, I wish all people were like me, to the Corinthians, but each has a particular gift from God. One is a gift and another has that one. I'm telling all those who are single and widows that it's good for them to stay single like me. So Paul is not kind of telling you should get married as much as he's saying it's good not to have marriage because you can dedicate yourself to full-time study and preparation and getting closer to God. My sons Heather went to Catholic school through 8th grade. My sons went to a preschool and a kindergarten program at the local Catholic school. And the priest, Father Chuck, and I used to have conversations, and he would say to me, I hope we don't mess them up too much. And I would say, Chuck, don't worry about it. Whatever you mess them up here, I'll fix them when they get home. You know? And we talk about that all the time. But Ben had a little friend who had a little speech impediment, and he would always say, how are you a priest and you married? And I would say, well, it's not quite the same thing. We're a little different, you know. It's like, we're not do that. And I used to tell Chuck and other Catholic friends, the practicality of a single priesthood, I get, because there are times when you can't do all the things you want to do because you have to do other obligations. You have to raise kids and you have to do all that stuff. And it would be, in some days, it would be easy if you didn't have all those kind of things and you were just focused on this and this alone. And, you know, you could go where you need to go and you can do what you need to do. I get the practicality of that for a Catholic priest. The theology behind it, I don't buy it. I would not. It would not be me if that was a requirement of United Methodist. I would have not done this. It was not who I. That's not who I am. I have not had that bent to that vow to be able to do that. I am very happy that I am in a relationship with Heather. I don't think that I would have. I'm happy to have children and I love being a dad and all that kind of stuff. But it was. There's a sense in which they would have, in that day and age, they would have understood that if you don't have those family obligations, then you can really just follow the rabbi around all the time. And there were times when a community or a family, especially if your family was wealthy, when they would pay for you to be able to study with the rabbi, they would pay for you to be able to kind of continue to do this. They would provide some resources for you to be able to do this, and a lot of people would do kind of the thing where they would say, I'm like Paul would talk about being a tent maker, and he would do this thing, and then he would be able to preach in different places. There were a lot of rabbis early on that would have jobs like that, and they would do these things for a season. They would do these things for a month or two or whatever it was, so they could go out teaching for a month or two at a time. So they would kind of have rhythms where they would do these things. And there were other people who were the students who even would later on would have trades that they would do to make money, and then they would kind of do that. So, but during the years when they were kind of at that point where they were kind of beyond if they stayed with the rabbi and they were doing that, they started to study these things called the rabbinic legal decisions, which were called halakot. That's the Hebrew word for it. It basically means learning to make good decisions like a rabbi. And so rabbis, one of the things that what rabbis were able to do is like the questions when Jesus asked, which is the greatest commandment or everything else, rabbis would often be asked, what do I do if my ox scores my neighbor or something like that? What's the legal decision? And it wasn't a judge that would make that decision. It was a rabbi who would make that decision based on what their interpretation of the law. And so there would be rabbinic legal decisions. And so you would have to, just like a judge or a lawyer today has to know precedent, you have to study these halakot, which was the rabbinic legal decisions, so you can know, if I'm a student of this rabbi, I don't want to just go against everything that they've taught and everything that they've done. So that's there.
Was that by rabbi? Did each rabbi have his own rabbinic? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Each rabbi had their own interpretation of how to apply the Torah to life. So it was, for instance, like one of the things that happens is the work on the Sabbath. can't work on the Sabbath. And each rabbi would interpret that differently. So if you were following a different rabbi, you might be, I can walk this far before it's considered work. So I have to live within a certain location of the synagogue and all that kind of stuff. And so I had to do that stuff. Or another rabbi said, no, you can walk 2 miles farther than that, or whatever it might be. So they would interpret it differently, and so you would kind of study your rabbi. And still today in some different, just like in Christian denominations, there's differences between, the joke is always, the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist. The Methodists say hello to each other in the liquor store. That's kind of the joke. There are differences like that of customs and rules and things you do and you don't do. You have to be dances at the Baptist church when you were growing up, did you? There's differences between stuff like that.
We had a big banquet, so we wouldn't go to the prom.
That's right. See, I mean, there are things that, and it's not that. It's that they're just a different way of doing it. And the same with the rabbis. Today, there's Jewish traditions that come different kind of ways. That's why you have Hasidic Jews that don't cut the forelocks because that's part of the. You have other Jews that dress a certain way and don't do other things, and some that will walk a certain way, or some that don't even keep kosher anymore because it's not. It's just all different interpretations. Just like for us as Christians, there are different interpretations of that. That was true then as well for rabbis, different rabbis. Now, they weren't quite as diverse as they are now because it was pretty tight, but there were some different interpretations of some of that stuff.
But there had to be a fair number of rabbis back then.
Yes, but there were two main schools of thought. There were two main rabbis. They were kind of the way they thought. It was a school of that. So if you were a rabbi, this rabbi, if you went back, most Methodist preachers have on their wall. I never got one of these. I never did this, but they have on their wall a list of kind of tracing their ordination back to John Wesley. They'll go, Bishop this ordained me, and Bishop this ordained him, and Bishop this ordained, and then they can trace it back with so many steps back to John Wesley. I think rabbis would have traced that genealogy of their school of thought back to one of the older rabbis that would have been there. So yes, they told two people, and they told two people, and it gets wider and wider, but it goes back to kind of the beginning of all this stuff.
I was just wondering, my ox did this to my neighbor. Well, your answer is this. Well, I don't like that answer. I'm going to appeal it to Rabbi Ryan.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I see it different than.
Yeah, so kind of like the story where they say, I went to Kroger and went to the checkout line. They said it was going to be $200. I didn't like that, so I went through the self-checkout. It was only $25. It's kind of that same kind of thing. Yeah, I get that. So, yes.
I want to digress a little
Yes.
bit. Go ahead. No rabbis married, right? Yes or no?
No, I mean, that's not true. There were
Some that do. Just going back to that last statement with Paul saying, it was better to be single. And he's including widows in that, but weren't the widows the ones that had to be taken care of?
They
because
were.
They couldn't do anything but housework and cook.
They were, but the idea was that once you were widowed, or once you raised your kids, or once you did and you got to be that age, you could then kind of step aside and really kind of dedicate yourself to following after.
Who fed you?
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about. I'll get there. All right, I'll get there. So anyway, the rabbi's rules, or how they did this, were called his yoke. When you studied under a certain rabbi, you took his yoke upon you. So think about this. When Jesus says, "Put my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light." So the yoke he talks about there is his teaching. It's this idea that some rabbis, their teaching was pretty harsh. I mean, you had to follow the letter of the law, and it was pretty intense. And some rabbis were not quite so. And Jesus is kind of saying, I'm not going to burden you with unnecessary kind of stuff, which the rabbis would often do. course, if you think about this, there were 631 laws in the Old Testament. Jesus boils it down to love God and love your neighbor. And then at the end of his life, he boils it down to love others as I have loved you. So, I mean, Jesus takes it from 631 to 2 to 1 in his life. And there's a sense in which, he gets this idea that, I'm not going to make this ridiculous about, So when he says things like, you've heard it said, but I say to you. And some of those statements really do intensify the command. You've heard it said, do not murder, but I say you don't even get angry with your neighbor, with your friend. I mean, that kind of adds to the thing that steps it up. But Jesus is saying, my burden is easy, and my yoke is easy to bear, my burden is light. So that's his teaching. It wasn't about an endless list of rules and regulations. So I think one of the things that's clear is that when Jesus starts speaking like this, he's not just picking words out of thin air. He's speaking like a rabbi would speak. And that's important for us to do that. So only the brightest of the bunch would be included on this. And only those men who measured up at the standards of the rabbi would begin to have their training. And they would begin to have a training at that point in their 20s to be a rabbi themselves. And if a rabbi determined you were good enough, he would say, come and take my yoke upon you and become my disciple. And at that time, a boy would leave everything, home and mother and father and synagogue and community, and devote their entire life to following that rabbi. And that training would go on until about the age of 30. Now, we think about, all right, you asked about money. It was forbidden to charge a fee to teach the Torah. You couldn't do that. But it was common for rabbis to practice a trade and to teach part-time. Disciples do the same. Some rabbis were from priestly families, so that the temple would they get a stipend from the temple to do it. But many just had other jobs. There are also reports about sometimes there's teaching sessions in the evenings, so that people who could do that, they would go and do it in the evening and go their time there. Some, again, would work seasonally and take time off between planting and harvesting or whatever to do that. Now, think about this. The gospel accounts of describe the disciples kind of fishing occasionally, even after they become the disciples of Jesus. So when Peter kind of says, I'm going fishing after the rest of it, it's not just this resignation to do this. It's also a part of kind of we have followed this rabbi. Now there's not a rabbi for us to follow, so we might as well go back and do what we do. There's a part of that story as well in there. Women would help manage the family farm, run the business, whatever it was, give the husband time to study. So you think of a verse like, it's real popular now, Proverbs 31, where the wife ran the business and the husband sat in the gate, either for government affairs or rabbinic legal decisions or discussions or whatever else. It's this kind of idea that the woman was kind of a part of this thing to make sure that her husband could do the stuff that he needed to do, or her son could do the stuff that he needed to do to study and to do that. Extended families would also support a brother or a son who was doing that. So that was it. The next stage of life after this is at 30. It's called the age of Koach. In Jewish culture, turning 30 is viewed as a significant milestone, representing the achievement of full strength and maturity. According to the Talmud, turning 30 is a time of receiving strength and the ability to pursue one of life's goals. So basically, the period is understood in the Talmud as a culmination of the trial and error period of your 20s. You survived your 20s, and now you're 30, and you're ready to do that. You've maybe had your family, and you've been married, and you've kind of done this stuff. You've learned this trade. You do this stuff. At 30, you're going to do this. There's a rabbi, Samuel ben Meir, who suggests that 30 is the age when you are worthy of leadership. Another commentator says that 30 is the age when one becomes with the ability to perform even difficult tasks, And the 30 is the age when the Levites would begin their service at the tent of meeting, and the priestly Levites in the Old Testament would do that. So, like, there's a story here: the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, take census of the Kohathites from among the Levites, from their clans and their households, from 30 to 50 years old, all who were eligible for service to do the work of the meeting tent. So you had to be 30, and you couldn't be over 50 to be able to be active in following your priestly role in the church. So that was kind of there for that. But at that time, at 30, you were about ready to enter the mainstream of society and start to do your own thing. Now, we stop and think about that timeline for just a minute. The gospel tells us that Jesus was about 30 when he began his ministry. Immediately after that, he began to choose his own disciples to follow him. So that's when you were at 30, you were released to be a rabbi on your own and to call on your own disciples if you made it through there. So like there's a story of wedding at Cana of Galilee. On the third day, there was a wedding, and Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." And Jesus replied, "Woman, what does it have to do with me? My time has not come yet." So when he talks about his time has not come yet, has he not been released at that age to be a rabbi on his own? Has he not received that kind of thing like that? Is it a part of the thing? Because Jesus, while he did a lot of things that were out of the ordinary, he did a lot of things that kind of fit with the way that they did that. So Jesus kind of did that. For most rabbis, disciples, again, would come to them and ask them to follow them. "Can I be your disciple?" But Jesus would do that. He said that, as I said before, "You didn't choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and produce fruit." And so Jesus is the one who's choosing his disciples. At one point, when Jesus is just telling them, "I chose you. You are not the brightest and the best." Because think about this: these disciples. It says that one day he was walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he saw two brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, throw fishing nets into the sea because they were fishing. So, what this may have meant is that these guys, at some point, some rabbi had looked at them and said, "You're just not going to make the cut. Go home and learn the family business." They were fishermen with their dad. They weren't just fishing for a season, it seems like. They were really being fishermen. So we also think about how did his dad feel when they just jumped off the boat and started going, they were fishing with their dad, James and John fishing with their dad, and all this kind of stuff. How did dad feel when they left him there to do that? Dad would have been like, "Yeah, go. Your rabbi's asking you to follow him." It would not have been that unheard of for a young man to say, if a rabbi's going to invite me to be his student to follow him, I will do this. It wasn't just a kind of an avoidance of any responsibility to do that. But again, Jesus did not select anyone who made it up to that point. He got people who were doing all kinds of other tasks. He called guys who were lesser in the world's eyes than all the other people. And there we go. So Jesus was not worried so much, as we'll discover in this thing, about where they were, where they've been, what they've done, or what had been done to them. He was worried about finding disciples who were willing to follow in his footsteps. Jesus picked these ordinary guys with hopes and dreams of their own, but those who were willing to kind of give up a little bit of that and follow after him. So that's where we'll go. We'll discuss what that means and where Jesus is inviting us to go. And if we're going to invite to follow Jesus, then we learn to live life like Jesus, and we need to begin to understand that if we're going to follow Jesus, we got to discover kind of where his footsteps generally led. So any questions about this kind of stuff like that? So I want to tell you a little about where we're going to go. We kind of talked about this. If you look in the front of your book, you can kind of see the steps. I've laid that out for you. Jesus' feet regularly walked to. We'll talk about time alone with God. There's story after story about how Jesus pulled away from all the crowds or anything else going on and spent time alone with God. How Jesus was not afraid to go into his feet to walk into messy places, into messy lives and messy people, and things that were kind of a lot of other rabbis would not have gone in his day because that would have made them kind of ritually unclean, impure, and unable to perform some of the other things. He walked in intentional relationships. He was followed by a large crowd of people and was in intentional relationship with a very small group of people, and how that worked. And then ultimately how Jesus' feet walked toward the cross. And so again, the questions we ask isn't whether we believe in Jesus. That's not the question. The question we should be asking ourselves as a disciple is where are our feet taking us? And someone once said that the question is not, if you want to know where you are as a follower of Jesus, don't look back over 35 years and see where you've come. Look down at where your feet are right now. And that's kind of where we are. So I started with that joke about somebody not being here because they're not being the hands and feet of Jesus, and that I'll end with saying, that's probably all right. So they're here and they're doing that, and it's important work, and it's important to look down at where our feet are right now as we seek to follow Jesus.